Welcome to the MindBodyCouple podcast.
I'm Tanner Murtaugh.
And I'm Ann Hampson.
This podcast is dedicated to helping you unlearn chronic pain and symptoms.
If you need support with your healing, you can book in for a consultation with one of our therapists at painpsychotherapy.ca.
Or purchase our online course at embodicommunity.com to access in-depth education, somatic practices, recovery tools, and an interactive community focused on healing. Links in the description of each episode. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back.
Welcome. Me and Ann.
We went to Colorado.
Yeah, we went to the Psychophysiologic Disorders Association.
Yeah, we were without our children. It was a break.
Yeah.
But it didn't quite feel like a break. It was a lot of work.
Still work.
Going to the conference.
And we heard from so many people that have been using our content.
Yes, and I want to say for those of you that we connected with or just those of you listening, it was so amazing to hear so much feedback and see people in person and know that this podcast is useful. So we just want to say thank you.
Yeah, there was just so many people. It was lovely to hear because a lot of times either I'm alone in a room talking
with the cats,
or I'm with Ann talking
alone, also in a room. Sometimes,
so we don't know. We don't know the impact, and of course, in our one-on-one sessions, therapeutically, we see that.
Yeah,
but it was amazing to hear about just the number of people that have healed their chronic pain or symptoms with the support of our content or our digital course, which is amazing. And next episode, me and Ann are putting together some of our learnings from the conference. So we'll talk about that. Yes, we had a sneak peek. We had lunch with Schubiner.
That's right. And it was pretty awesome. And we had some learnings there too. So we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah, we were at a table with Dr. Howard Schubiner over lunch.
Tanner was a bit nervous.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
He's great. But he's such a kind, warm man.
Mm-hmm.
But today,
though, we're not talking about that now. We are going on to a very intense subject matter, which is why we're doing it today, because it's the top of Tanner's mind.
Yes. So today we're going to discuss perfectionism and chronic pain or illness.
Yes. And it's the top of Tanner's mind, because I think this is something that you struggled with a lot and that really connected to your symptoms.
It did. Even now, I don't have chronic pain, but the odd time I do get symptoms, it's usually when my perfectionism's just been dialed up a little too much. I've gotten good over the years of reducing it, or even had periods where it's not really even noticeable. But if I let that slide, that perfectionism, that is a nasty trigger to my pain, as I've learned.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon as you go through this journey to figure out these different triggers for your symptoms.
Yes. And perfectionism is highly associated with neuroplastic pain and symptoms.
How highly, Tanner? What do you mean?
This is a common trait. Not everyone has it. I've worked with people that aren't perfectionists, but I've worked with a lot of perfectionists that have chronic pain or chronic illness.
Would you say like half of the people you've worked with, how common is this?
It's probably more than that. I don't have an exact stat on the amount of clients, but it's probably more than half.
Yes.
And this makes sense because when we engage in perfectionism, we often have these high hopes of performance, right? That this performing well is going to bring us success, happiness, security, social acceptance.
Oh, that sounds pretty good.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
What it actually brings, though.
Oh, the downside.
The reality of perfectionism, which I keep learning this lesson over and over again. What perfectionism actually brings, pressure, self-criticism, guilt and shame, lack of self-care and burnout, loss of social connection, this high fight or flight energy, anxious, angry energy, and eventually for a lot of perfectionists, just a complete freeze and shutdown of their nervous system.
Well, and I think that makes sense then why it's so highly associated with pain and symptoms.
Yeah.
Because it brings on pressure, criticism, guilt, shame, and we all know those can be drivers.
Yeah. And a frequent thing I think people just don't understand is that you can change your perfectionism.
Why is that like confusing, do you think, sometimes?
I think it's confusing for people because the amount of people I've worked with where they're like, well, I'm just a perfectionist. Like they're so enmeshed with that trait. And I think a lot of times people think about it as like a personality trait.
Yes.
Right? This is part of my personality. This is who I am. I'm a perfectionist, for better or worse.
It's funny because I know this, and you guys are probably, if you follow our podcast, know this, but I know this is like a pet peeve of yours, Tanner, thinking of it as a personality trait necessarily.
Yeah.
Because it can feel fixed then, and we can't move it. It's fixed. It's stuck. There's no change.
Exactly. There's nothing we can do. We're just going to have to learn to deal with it.
Yeah.
The reality is perfectionism is a coping mechanism.
Okay.
It develops often in childhood, not always, but often in childhood, as a way to cultivate feelings of safety and control. Perfectionism can cultivate safety when we grew up in an environment that has some of these factors like cultural or familiar values of excellence and high achievement, caregivers placing excessive demands on you and pressures on you. Love and praise was based on performance or talents, or there was abuse or neglect. It makes sense if we perform well, if we do well, if we're perfect in all these sorts of ways, that we are going to be more loved and accepted by our family. We're sometimes in abuse situations, we're actually going to be physically safer. And so it makes sense that it's a coping mechanism that takes place for people. So starting to shift our views that it's about coping and not necessarily personality trait, like what does that do for someone? What did that do for you? What it did for me, and it was a big aha moment when I came to this and read various books and things to learn about this. It made me realize that this is changeable.
Yeah.
Now, I think to some degree I can snap back in because my brain's gotten so used for many years to being perfectionistic, but it's changeable. It's reducible. That it's possible. I think that's what it opens up when we start to understand this is a coping mechanism. And it's understanding it's a coping mechanism that's probably no longer working for you.
And so that's important to start to understand then that it's not working for you, or understand that maybe I do want to change it or need to change it.
Exactly. And I think it's really understanding there's a capacity to change it, but at the same time there should be a desire to change it, because as we'll talk about a little bit later, it really is linked to chronic pain and symptoms. Because perfectionists live in this high pressure, high intensity, self-critical zone so often that it's hard for our brain and nervous system to ever feel safe.
Well, and I think maybe an example is thinking about reflect on a high pressure time. And then what do we do with our body? It's like tense. We feel kind of like we can't stop racing thoughts, right? So, and if that's connected to perfectionism, that's evidence right there of that pressure on our body.
Exactly. And the unfortunate part is our capitalistic society and our culture really breeds perfectionists. It creates them.
Yeah.
This makes sense. A capitalistic culture is going to come with a competitive nature. Demands for excessive productivity. Self-worth feels really based on these external successes and the status, like what's your status in your career.
So even thinking back of school or grade school or growing up, we learn this.
And each success provides some temporary relief where we feel better, we feel safer. And anything less than this like perfectionistic success starts to feel dangerous.
I think that's a really powerful line, Tanner. Anything less feels dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
What can that dangerous feeling show up like for someone?
Well, I think, for a lot of perfectionists, myself included, it can be this anxious, angry energy.
Yeah.
This like high fight or flight energy that takes place. Because then if you failed, how do you cope? You try to even be more perfect and put more pressure on yourself.
Yes.
So it's this awful feedback loop that starts to take place for people.
Well, and I think another way it shows up, you're right, like this anxious energy. So we become more perfectionistic, or also this spiral of negative, combative self-talk.
Mm-hmm. It's like that self-criticism, real trademark of perfectionism.
Yep.
And, it's just understanding this connection that we want people to really, lock in. Because if I never had chronic pain or symptoms, I don't think I ever would have even messed with my perfectionism. I don't know if I ever would have been motivated to change it.
Okay, so that's an interesting statement, though, Tanner, because it's like, well, did you change it because of the pain? Do you wish you could still have it? Are you like
now? Right? I see what it brings outside of just being pain-free, because there's great benefits. There's great regulation, wellness, connection to people. Like there's so many benefits to reducing perfectionism. What I am saying by, if I never had pain, I probably would have never changed it. Is I was fine with the anxiety. I would have sat with awful anxiety and just been miserable. Would have been great. You would also have been miserable.
Yes.
But pain was such a loud danger signal being sent to me that I knew I had to change it.
Well, and that's a nod to what are your pain and symptoms telling you. And I think for you, Tanner, they were really saying, hey, this is something you need to look at.
Mm-hmm. Now, if this was simple, you all wouldn't be listening to this podcast right now.
Yes, we understand that this is not an easy task.
No. And the difficult part about reducing perfectionism is people have such fear that they won't be loved, they won't be safe, they won't be socially accepted if they're imperfect.
What if like someone has evidence that maybe shows them that, like an incident or something happened?
Yeah, like evidence that showcases these negative sides, essentially.
Or no, sorry, shows them that like if I change this, that I won't be loved. So say like they weren't perfect and then they lost out on an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's potential that reducing your perfectionism can have negative effects. Will it bring more positive? Yeah, I believe it will. But could I, if I had kept on with my perfectionistic ways, could I have been more successful in my career? Yeah, probably. Probably. And I don't say that with a chip on my shoulder. I'm upset about that. I just think that that's the reality is I know myself, my work ethic, my hyper focus, and I still have it to some degree and utilize it at a level that's reasonable, and I have greater well-being and health.
Well, and that's it. So say like, what would be the cost to continuing on with that perfectionism, right? Or, yeah.
And it would have just been complete misery for me. And for myself, I know without a doubt my pain would have never reduced or dissipated if I had kept down that path.
Yeah.
And so there is cost to reducing your perfectionism. And it's okay if you're listening to this podcast and you're swearing at us right now.
And you're like, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to lose out.
I don't even want to hear this. They don't want to hear. That's okay. Everyone has to make their own choices here.
Yeah.
This is a big choice to start reducing it. It's a scary choice. We don't know how things are going to turn out. Maybe you will miss opportunities. Maybe a boss will be less happy with you. And hopefully, over time, you find relationships that you are safe in, even when you are imperfect.
Well, and so that's really it. So it's learning, okay, can I be okay with maybe a consequence happening or the unknown happening? And trying to kind of ease in and lean into that. right? And then okay when things aren't perfect. And so that is the challenge.
Yeah. So let's dive into 2 essential ways to reduce perfectionism.
Okay. Number 1, exposure and sitting with the backdraft.
So we'll talk about this here. This is something I teach
Yes.
to every single person I talk to. And nobody likes it.
No.
And I get it. I didn't like it either. To reduce perfectionism, you need to actually give yourself exposure to being imperfect. Sounds super obvious. It's like super simple. Oh, this is all I have to do. But again, this comes with some negatives as well. So we're going to dive into this. But examples of reducing your perfectionism, being more imperfect, could be not cleaning the whole kitchen. Instead, just wiping down one of the counters.
I'm going to practice that later today.
I'll do the rest.
No. The joke here is Tanner's not going to do any of it. And I'm practicing, being imperfect and letting my house be imperfect. I just had to be clear about that to people.
I know.
Yeah.
I tried to throw that in there. You called me on it.
But this example is a good example of doing some, but being okay with not all.
Yeah. Not triple checking an email before sending it.
I got this. Do you?
Do I triple check emails? Now I 1 check.
So he has reduced that.
Yeah. I used to check it 7 or 8 times.
Okay,
Emails that weren't that important.
So I want to say this example is something that Tanner really has practiced and utilized in terms of I'm going to expose myself to the anxiety or uncertainty.
Letting yourself wing it a bit on a work presentation.
I feel like most people are I'm not winging it. So what do you mean by that, Tanner?
So I don't wing my presentations either. I just like the term wing it.
Yeah.
Perfectionists are just so upset right now.
If you're cringing at that, that's something to think about.
Yeah. We had to wing it in bold. Anyways, sorry. I used to uber prepare for presentations. And I'm good at presenting. I am. It's just a natural thing that I'm quite good at. And then I would still over prep. So over prep.
So when you reflect on that, Tanner, that perfectionist in you over prepping, how did you feel in your body? How did you feel in your nervous system when that was happening for you?
Essentially, it was an anti-anxiety. That's what I was doing. It was my anti-anxiety medication. I was anxious about the presentation. So what do? Hyper-focus. Meticulously go slide by slide in my PowerPoints. Now,
some people might think that sounds good. So why was that unhelpful for you?
It was so much stress. I was using it to try and reduce anxiety, but I took it so far past that.
Okay.
That was constant in fight or flight.
Yes.
And so I don't wing it, but I write my presentation up of my 700 PowerPoint slides. I have a storage of them. And I put it together, and now I'll read it through once, and I'm going to present. I am not running through this 7 or 8 times like I used to.
Okay. So it's not about being unprepared, but it's about not putting this excessive pressure and also letting go a little bit with the results.
Exactly. Valuing time for relaxation over working.
I feel like you're still working on this, Tanner.
I am.
Yes.
Getting better, though.
Yes. What happens to you on days you're not valuing time for relaxation? Are you falling into perfectionism?
Yeah,
then?
Usually it's a hyper focus, and I'm just I get honed in on one thing and breaking that. I've gotten better at it over time, but it took some of this exposure work of, hey, maybe I value sitting on a couch and doing nothing right now.
And is that hard for you at first or even now when you
totally
practice
was.
that?
And some of these examples for people, they might seem really big, and we'll give some guidance of how to utilize this. Half an hour probably would have been too much at first, though. Cooking a simple meal for the holiday instead of planning and cooking something difficult and pressureful.
How would that be exposure for someone, do you think?
Well, I think I put this example down because some people are very perfectionistic about their dinner parties or holidays. And we actually have a fairly good system with this, like even last Christmas, on Christmas Eve, we have our family over. And we cooked something that wasn't that hard.
Yeah.
Like it was a crock pot meal. We bought some of the things so we didn't have to make it. Like we simplified it. And just like I felt so much calmer than if I had created some huge masterpiece at the end of the day, right?
And that's a success piece of reducing perfectionism, is feeling like, okay, I'm teaching myself to take the pressure off, and that does feel good. That's why we want to do this.
Yeah. Okay, a few more examples here. Only giving a task 60 to 70% effort. This is useful. Sometimes you don't have to like change what you're doing. You just have to change the amount of effort. It could be giving more control to others on your team.
Tanner works at that too.
I'm working on it.
I am his team.
You're my teammate.
And sometimes he struggles to give me the control.
Yeah, I'm working on it though.
But when he does, there's great results.
It's great results.
Yeah,
Have
he needs the trust of it.
Good teammate. And lastly, relaxing deadlines when possible. So the secret here is we listed a bunch because we wanted to give examples of like, what could exposure actually look like? Some of those might seem really small to you. Some of them might seem really big. Everyone's different. The secret here is to start small and work your way up to bigger exposures.
Yes.
So for example, I started with emails, only reading it twice through, then only reading it once through. It was a small example, still hard at first. And eventually I got to a place of like I had to go write a social work college exam. And I only gave it 60% effort. I still studied, but like my attention wasn't fully there and I passed, which is great. But that would have been a way too big of an exposure at first. So the reason you're making the exposure small is you're going to get a backdraft.
Yes.
And this backdraft, you think of a backdraft. So when there's a fire in a building, right? And you open a window, new oxygen hits the flame. And flames burst out, is what happens to perfectionists. They're like, okay, I'm only going to read this email twice. Only going to read it twice. They read it twice. And then they just get this backdraft of difficult emotion. Anxiety, shame, guilt. And then, even though they've already hit send, they're now going back into their their sent folder and they're rereading it and maybe responding to the person, oh, sorry for the correction. Like I'm making fun of it because this is me. But that's why you want to make the exposure small, because you're going to get that backdraft of difficult emotions that hit. And you can somatically work with it and learn to sit with it. But if you make your exposure too big, it's not going to be tolerable and you're going to snap back into perfectionism.
Yeah, and that backdraft is ultimately what we're exposing to, is those sensations and kind of that feeling that happens in the body. Yeah.
And of course, using all the practices on my YouTube channel and on our podcast, that's how you sit with the backdraft. And our course, we have lots of practices in there as well to help people process and release difficult emotions or dysregulation.
Yeah.
But we want to mention another brief thing that's important here. So the second way you can work on reducing your perfectionism is accepting your imperfections with self-compassion.
And we want to really highlight here, self-compassion is the key to this.
Not critical lens.
Yes.
The last thing people with perfectionism want to do is accept their vulnerabilities.
Or have self-compassion. That is something that's not very common.
It's not. And having self-compassion about vulnerabilities is definitely off the table. Right. You combine those two.
Yes. So we understand it's difficult.
And I relate to it. I remember I was doing mind body work when I was first healing. I was a little bit ways in. And actually, we were in Ontario with your family. I have this crystal clear memory. And I was doing like a bit of a journaling and then moved to a somatic practice on just my emotions. And I had this idea of like, what if you're just average? Like, what if you're average, Tanner? And that was such an unacceptable feeling I had inside of like, oh my goodness, that would be terrible. And it really hit. And I was like, okay, there's something to work on here. Like, I got to work on this because there was such a lack of compassion for myself. But, healing perfectionism means gaining acceptance of our vulnerabilities and giving ourselves compassion for this. And I still want to do good work. I have goals in life. I will achieve things. But if I push myself to just be the best at absolutely everything, I'm not going to have any sort of wellness or health.
Well, and that's it. And we're not saying, hey, don't strive for greatness and your goals and all these pieces. 100% still work on that. But it's more about doing that with a bit of balance and understanding that we can't operate 100% at all times. Like, we're just not built to do that.
Yeah, and if you really want to do a deep dive into self-compassion, two great researchers on this, Kristen Neff and Chris Germer.
Yes.
Really, really great. They got some great books. I used to teach, actually, a self-compassion group with them. It was wonderful content. So if you want to do a deep dive, there's lots of books out there that you can check out by both of those authors. But here's the thing, is it's the law of averages.
Yeah.
The truth is that most of us are going to be average at some things, maybe better at some things, and just below average at other things. And that's normal.
Yes.
And I think in our capitalistic society, we don't view that as a normal thing, but that's normal. We all have things we suck at. It sucks to say that, but I have things that I suck at.
He's not very good at interacting with horses. You guys,
I'm not.
I have to say, we talk about my love of horses a lot sometimes on this podcast. Tanner is terrified to even touch a horse.
Yeah, it scares me.
And so, he's probably not going to excel in the horse world.
I'm not going to be a jockey.
No, well...
I'm small like a jockey. I have the right body frame. I just don't have the right brain.
You can't even, pet the horse's head.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not my thing. It's not my thing.
But there's got to be a bit of acceptance that, we can't be perfect at everything. And we're not going to be perfect at all times. So this idea of I'm going to do a perfect job today and tomorrow and the next day at 8 a.m. and at 5 p.m., it's just not possible.
Yeah. So this is our episode on perfectionism, chronic pain, chronic symptoms. Lots to work on here for people. So we will talk to you next week. Next week, we're going to dive into some of our learnings from the conference.
Yeah.
Lots of great content to come. All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Thanks for listening. For more free content, check out the links for our YouTube channel, Instagram, and Facebook accounts in the episode description.
We wish you all healing.